Hello, my gentle and of course very modern apes. My name is Erica. This is my channel gutsickgibbon, and what we do here is we talk all about different subjects in paleontology and biology, specifically looking at human evolution and primatology, and we debunk a lot of pseudoscience, and usually that pseudoscience is young Earth creationism.
Okay, I'm well aware that this is not a talent, but this is like the only thing that I can do.
To bring a couple of you out there up to speed who might be new here, young Earth creationism is the typically evangelical here in the West belief that the Abrahamic God created the Earth more or less in its present state approximately 6,000 years ago, and that the entire geologic column from the Cambrian to the Cretaceous, sometimes even later than that, as well as all the fossils and geologic signatures found within that geologic column, is the result of Noah's flood, a worldwide flood that killed every single organism on the planet besides the denizens of the Ark, and that all of modern biodiversity is the result of the proliferation of those survivors. You might be thinking, who cares about young Earth creationism? It's 2024. Who out there is still proposing it? And the answer is many people, including the current Speaker of the House of the United States of America, who also writes for Answers in Genesis on occasion. Now, one of my favorite arguments against young Earth creationism as an idea, and in fact, I would actually go so far as to say this is maybe my absolute favorite argument, just due to its simplicity and weight, its gravity, its mass. It's called the heat problem, and while many arguments against young Earth creationism do a pretty good job making it look implausible, this argument makes young Earth creationism impossible. And I would love to sit here and take credit for this argument as if I'm the one who came up with it, but it's actually the young Earth creationists who did a lot of the initial legwork for this massive issue with their ideology. I will take some credit, though, for popularizing the idea, at least here on YouTube. I have done a copious amount of content on the heat problem specifically.
And up next, I don't know why I'm like this or what's wrong with me. Stay tuned for more.
Which is kind of funny because my specialty is actually human evolution. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in biological anthropology, and some of the videos that I've made about the heat problem are just outlining what the problem actually is, while others are looking at attempts by young Earth creationists to solve the problem. I've been making videos about this subject for many years now, and collectively, these videos have garnered hundreds of thousands of views. But what delights me the most is when I creep into the comment section on any given young Earth creationism video, and if the video is sufficiently large enough, there will be people in the comments saying, no, this isn't going to work because of the heat problem, regardless of the topic of the young Earth creationist video in question. I love to see that. And it hasn't escaped the attention of some of the bigger young Earth creationist organizations, some who have explicitly been trying to solve the heat problem for decades now and have still come up empty-handed. Of course, we also see numerous responses from YouTube young Earth creationists who still try to make the whole ideology work, despite the fact that we've got a physics-shaped problem burning a hole in the entire tapestry. But like I've said, I've done so many videos on the heat problem, so what could I possibly be here to say at this point? And the answer is, I want to make a case to you that I think the heat problem is killing scientific creationism. Now, let me be clear on what I mean here. The heat problem has already killed young Earth creationism as a viable idea. A great many arguments within big S science actually do that, from biology to physics to geology to chemistry to astronomy and so on and so forth. What I mean when I say that I think the heat problem is killing scientific creationism is that I think this issue is killing the creationist enthusiasm for arguing that young Earth creationism is scientific. As a super quick, simple example, when someone asks how can you get all of modern biodiversity today in just 4,300 years, they'll point to examples of quick speciation occurring in the lab or in the wild currently, and then extrapolate that backward and say, see, If we can see this at play today in this particular example, then we can retroactively apply it to all of life. And they'll do this with all sorts of different things. They'll point to small-scale, unique geologic events with specific geologic signatures, like specific characteristics that denote this unique circumstance, and then apply that also retroactively to explain all geologic formations and phenomena that we have in the world today. The Mount St. Helens eruption laid down layers of ash super quickly, like over the course of a couple of days to a couple of weeks. So why can't we explain the entire geologic column, 4.5 billion years worth of history, in just the single year of the flood, or at least the last 550 million years worth of the geologic column in just the single Noachian deluge? Why not? The answer, I hope, is obvious, and that's that those ash layers from Mount St. Helens, again, have specific diagnostic criteria that we can identify and associate with this type of unique event. And surprise, surprise, we don't find those characteristics in the entirety of the geologic column. I could go on and on and on using examples like those previous two, but suffice it to say, the idea is that they want to explain the natural world simultaneously using a young Earth creationist perspective and science. They want to say that science supports young Earth creationism, and it simply doesn't. Their reticence to just point to a supernatural explanation, okay, like the flood was supernatural and that's how we explain all of the geologic and paleontologic phenomena that we find in the geologic column, I think that that comes from their sort of residual desire to keep the idea of maybe getting creationism back into the schools alive. If they admit that part of this or most of this needs supernatural action, then they can't get this taught side by side along conventional science in the science classroom. So they have to hold on to the idea that, yeah, it's supported and it is supported by natural phenomena. But the heat problem is starting to change that. Now, like I said, I have done just oodles and oodles of videos on this subject, and I'm not inclined to sit down and record the same thing every single time, as I've already done many times over. I've gotten sick of it. So this video is going to have a few clips where I feel appropriate. So first things first, what is the heat problem? You can find a seriously in-depth look at the heat problem here, and then also here, and also here. But the long story short of it is this. So creationists want to suppose that Noah's Ark and Noah's flood is responsible for the entirety of the geologic column. And depending on the creationist you're talking to, it might be 4.5 billion years worth of the geologic column, or just 500 million years worth of the geologic column, the latter spanning from the Cambrian to the Cretaceous, or potentially even into the Cenozoic, which would boost it to like 550 million years worth of just events. And when I say events, I mean every impact event, every mass extinction, all of the radioactive decay, all of the rock formation, the movement of the continents from supercontinent to separate continents and back again, all of that has to be explained during the year-long event of Noah's flood, because that is the event that is supposed to be responsible for the geologic column and thus everything recorded within it. They do this so they can basically say that what appears to be just a ton of time is actually a very small amount of time and just a very catastrophic event. They're trying to cram 4.5 billion to 500 million years worth of processes into a single year. Obviously, this entire scenario runs contra to the very ancient age of the Earth and an actualistic perspective provided by conventional science, which states that the Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. This is done using radiometric dating, and an interesting little tidbit about this is that most young Earth creationists, and indeed the ones that work for like Answers in Genesis and the like, will agree that the radiometric dates that we pull from a lot of these rock samples do appear to be legitimate indicators of radioactive decay, and this is important. All radiometric dating is an appeal to very basic laws in physics, more specifically the radioactive decay law. It works a little something like this. You take a sample of rock, and in that rock you are going to have elements, and specifically radioactive isotopes. Some of these isotopes are extremely stable, and some of them are not stable at all. And unstable radioactive isotopes will spontaneously decay into a more stable daughter product at a known rate. The amount of time that it takes for half of the amount of that parent material to decay into its daughter product is its known half-life. And we know half-lives are consistent and constant because we have tested this over and over and over again in the lab and using observation in natural environments. So let's say we have a rock formed with uranium-238 in it. Uranium-238 is unstable and will decay into lead-206 after 4.5 billion years. If you were present at the formation of this rock example, and then you waited 4.5 billion years and came back, it would be half uranium-238 and half lead-206. If you would come back another 4.5 billion years later, half of that remaining uranium-238 will have decayed into lead-206, and so on and so forth. So what we can do then is look at any rock and look at the ratio of parent to daughter radioactive isotopes of known decay chains, and then take that back in time to see when the rock actually formed. This is called absolute dating, and it is extremely useful to us in the modern era because we use it to find fossil fuels in a process called basin modeling. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, that's great that we know how old the Earth is, but like, what does this have to do with the heat problem? Everything. Because when radioisotopes decay, they release heat. Not that much, but they release a little bit of heat every time this decay actually occurs, regardless of the series that we're looking at. Every year, we can actually measure the amount of heat that is put off, like due to this decay, like across the Earth or in isolation in labs for specific elements, specific decay chains, what have you. That's not a problem for conventional science because it's only a little bit every year. But what happens if you take 4.5 billion years worth of decay, or just 500 million years worth of decay, like the heat from that decay, and cram it into a single year? You get the vaporization of the granitic crust of the Earth several dozen times over, something that I hope I don't need to tell you a wooden boat would not survive. To put this into actual numbers, joules if you will, this is 1.86 times 10 raised 29 joules for 500 million years worth of decay. This is the equivalent of setting off 44 hydrogen bombs in every cubic kilometer of the planet. And if we up it to 4.5 billion years, it's 1.68 times 10 raised 30 joules. 402 hydrogen bombs for every cubic kilometer. For the record, to boil the oceans, you need 5.6 times 10 raised 26 joules of energy, and to vaporize it completely, you need 3.7 times 10 raised 27 joules. So that's just the nuclear decay. You can add things like the lithification of limestone, the hardening of all of the magma that we have to explain in the geologic column, all of the impact events and the friction of the continents as they go from Pangaea to the current positioning, or Rodinia to separating out and then Pangaea to current positioning. Like, none of this works. It's an obscene amount of heat. Most of those numbers come from young Earth creationists too, which is notable. In fact, Answers in Genesis just last year released their 4th article in a series on heat problems associated with the Genesis flood. Chronologically, this is just the latest in a long series of creationists, young Earth creationists, trying to solve this issue with radioactive decay, ancient dates, and the heat problem. It started with the RATE team, radioisotopes in the age of the Earth, back in the early 2000s, and it's still going on today. And the conclusions, as you've seen from some of the pictures that I've posted here in this video and some of my other videos, are 1, yes, it looks like a whole lot of radioactive decay has happened. 2, I guess that means at some point decay rates must have been faster. And that 3, that fast decay creates a whole lot of heat. So what do? Well, some creationists propose that accelerated nuclear decay simply creates too much heat, and so it must not have happened. And they propose alternative solutions, such as maybe God just made the rocks to look old. But that's problematic, right? Because that means the flood would have to shuffle all the rocks precisely atom by atom, just to make it look as though they follow the laws of superposition. Because remember, the flood has to be responsible for the vast majority of the geologic column. Otherwise, you have issues since there's a ton of dead things in all of them, and God presumably didn't create the Earth with dead things in the ground. And the last video that I made on the heat problem was actually about a guy who took that perspective. He showed up as a guest on the Standing for Truth channel, being interviewed by Donnie Badinsky, the eponymous host of said channel, and Donnie has been the main guy who's been trying to answer the heat problem. The big degree-holding creationists who work for like Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, or the Institute for Creation Research are saying either we're working on it or it's going to need a supernatural solution. But Donnie doesn't like that, and so he has had guest after guest on over the past several years in an attempt to solve the heat problem. We have the astronomer Jason Lisle, the late and hateful radio host show Bob Enyart, and the maybe paleobiologist Joseph Hubbard. And all of them note that there is also not currently a solution to the issue.
Do you think that this accelerated nuclear decay would have caused what they deem as the heat problem? They said, this convection and the subduction plates would have caused so much heat generated during this nuclear process that the oceans would have boiled. Have you heard of this?
Yes, I've heard of that. Yes, I haven't seen a detailed study on that.
I still don't think there's an excuse for this, right? Jason Lisle is a professional young earth creationist. He should know about the issues that plague his ideology. I know about the issues that plague young earth creationism. I could write a thesis on young earth creationism as an idea, all the different models, things of that nature. So I'm just kind of miffed that he doesn't have the numbers on hand. He doesn't know what the issue is in a quantitative sense. And there's a specific reason why this kind of ticks me off. But Lisle is also the first one to have proposed the Hypercanes solution that Donnie, our host of many of these shows, has come to really adore, despite the fact that we have gone over why it doesn't work many, many times.
There have been creationist models of hypercanes, for example, which is like a hurricane, but on a much more massive scale. There are other explanations for that. I don't have the numbers with me to see, which of these is the most plausible, but
I don't have the numbers with me to see.
But there are some possibilities right there. So certainly it's not a knockdown, drag-out argument against a accelerated decay because it produces heat. That's a feature. We need some heat to start the flood, and as long as you can dump it to space fast enough, you're going to be fine.
Right. That was a really good answer. Probably one of the best I've heard on that.
So I won't say that we can just easily easily solve the heat problem for hydroplate theory, if you want to call it a heat problem, in terms of having some summation of numbers that just gives us an absolute, this is solved, right? But
they'll say that these catastrophic processes during the flood, the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open, catastrophic plate tectonics, for example, they'll assert that a tremendous amount of heat is being produced from these processes, that it would preclude a global flood because this heat would boil the oceans, essentially, melt the crust, and kill Noah and the Ark due to the radiation. I know there's a lot of creation scientists working on this, so it's probably a question that could take a couple-hour lecture.
Yeah.
Of itself. But I'm curious, what are your specific thoughts on that objection that they want?
Okay, you are right. There's no one quick answer that I can just spill out and it's definitive and positive, but then that's fine. That's not a problem. There's so many problems from a secular point of view with deposition and so on and so forth anyway, as in you wouldn't physically get what we see around us if it was so, that it is going to be objections and issues on the creationist side as well. And the flood heat problem, as it's known, is a real problem. It's a genuine problem. And like you say, there are many creationists working on it. So...
But anywho...
And of course, who could forget David McQueen's blob model?
Tube.
So like I said, his most recent guest, which is the most recent video on the heat problem that I made, just doesn't think that accelerated nuclear decay is a thing, and for a very specific reason. Now, keep in mind, up until this point, Donnie was a big proponent of accelerated nuclear decay to explain the radioactive dates that we get from the rocks.
You did touch on this one at the end of your first presentation. So if you wanted to reiterate anything, as it is a major sticking point to the critics. So Gutsick-Gibbon is pointing out that the vast majority of the heat comes from accelerated nuclear decay, though. There's the amount there. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it was 10 to the 30 joules. I think it's like 2 or maybe it was 7, I don't remember, something times 10 to the 30 joules.
For the record, it depends on whether you're trying to deal with 500 million years worth of accelerated nuclear decay or 4.5 billion years worth of accelerated nuclear decay. A
lot of creationists that believe in that, and I don't believe in accelerated nuclear decay, but a lot of them that believe in that will try to throw that into the whole Noah's flood thing because they think it happened at the same time. But I think I've demonstrated exactly the problem you have with accelerated nuclear decay is that the temperature will keep rising until you get that steady state where you're releasing as much heat to outer space as you are generating. And so the only way to make accelerated nuclear decay work is you'd have to have some miraculous heat removal. And then now you've got to explain why God caused accelerated nuclear decay to happen and then had to miraculously remove the heat. It's like, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, why would God do that? I don't really see any reason why he would cause accelerated nuclear decay to happen. I mean, I realize that there's an issue with radiometric dating and it doesn't agree with the Bible, and I get that. I don't know what the solution for that is, but it's not accelerated nuclear decay. That's my opinion, anyways.
The only way to make accelerated nuclear decay work is you'd have to have some miraculous heat removal. And then now you've got to explain why God caused accelerated nuclear decay to happen and then had to miraculously remove the heat. And it's like, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, why would God do that? I don't really see any reason why he would cause accelerated nuclear decay to happen.
Wow. Amazing. Obviously, I thought this was very funny and harped on it quite a bit because, yeah, if you hold to accelerated nuclear decay and catastrophic plate tectonics, a flood model along with hydroplate bakes accelerated nuclear decay into it, they have to have it in order to explain radiometric dates that we have now. Like, that just doesn't work. It's too much heat. The guest here, who is an engineer, rightly points out that it's just too much heat. And if you're going to propose accelerated nuclear decay, you're going to need a miracle.
So, and just to clarify, because I understand what you were saying earlier, because you were saying that accelerated decay is not necessarily associated with CPT, because you were pointing out that some who hold the CPT would also hold to accelerated decay and make it part of it. Rather, you arguing CPT, but you don't hold to accelerated decay. So you can hold to CPT, but not accelerated decay.
Yeah, and as far as accelerated nuclear decay, it's got other problems than just heat.
Okay, well, I think that's good in terms of clarifying questions for now.
Yes, that's right. So we have all sorts of different flood models, catastrophic plate tectonics, hydroplate, many other less popular ones. And within those flood models, you can either propose that accelerated nuclear decay has happened and is responsible for like all of our modern dates, why everything looks so old, at least from a nuclear perspective, or you can just say, no, I don't believe that accelerated nuclear decay happened, and as for the dates, well, I don't know how really to explain that. My understanding is that accelerated nuclear decay was pretty tightly bundled with all of those flood models, but David here, our engineer guest on Donnie's channel, has shown us that no, that's not necessarily the case. And after hearing all of this in that video, I had this to say. Now, you may be like me and you're like, oh my goodness, is Donnie going to do the thing that he always does where he just takes the guest's position because he thinks it's like the most tenable one because it's the only one that at that exact moment in time has not been like thoroughly debunked. And interestingly enough, Donnie had this to say in the live chat about accelerated nuclear decay. You know, that thing that he's been going on about and supporting for the past several years.
Accelerated decay has happened. That's the most important point.
At Creation Myths, I don't believe accelerated decay happened. Matt and I gave a presentation on it last night. Well, oh my goodness, this is news to me. Since when, Donnie? What about this?
Accelerated decay has happened. That's the most important point.
Now, of course, I'm always one for changing your mind when new information comes to light. That's good. That's important. That is a valuable character trait to have. But, you know, Donnie doesn't seem to really commit to any idea that he holds. He kind of just like tenuously grasps at like the most likely solution for the heat problem at that given moment, throwing caution to the wind at all the additional problems that quote unquote solution actually provides. So like, I don't really take him very seriously on this. I don't think he's really thought very diligently about it because I would wager that he's going to be back at supporting accelerated nuclear decay before you know it. Because What are you going to do about the radiometric dates, Donnie? Well, I must be a psychic-type Pokemon because Donnie had Jason Lyle on recently to talk about the heat problem again. Jason Lyle, who is a catastrophic plate tectonics proponent who does believe that accelerated nuclear decay has happened. And Jason Lyle proceeded to make the same milquetoast argument that he made 2 years ago, after which Donnie had this to say.
So we have the evidence there, I think, very clearly for accelerated decay.
Wow, just like I said, isn't that so wonderful? Donnie is stuck in a Sisyphean loop. He is incapable of solving the heat problem, and so in order to make it seem like to his audience, I guess, that, maybe a solution is just around the corner, or maybe things aren't as bad as they seem, he just jumps from perspective to perspective and back again. How do creationists explain old nuclear dates?
Accelerated decay has happened.
But that creates a lot of heat. In fact,
The only way to make accelerated nuclear decay work is you'd have to have some miraculous heat removal.
So maybe it didn't happen. At Creation Myths, I don't believe accelerated decay happened. But then how do you explain those old dates?
The rate research group found very compelling evidence. I was not expecting it, that the rate of radioactive decay was faster in the past, possibly during the flood year, possibly during creation, possibly both.
Oh, so nuclear decay was accelerated.
So we have the evidence there, I think, very clearly for accelerated decay.
Okay, so we're back to accelerated nuclear decay, which means we don't have a solution for the heat problem. The 44 approximately hydrogen bombs that are going off in every cubic kilometer of the Earth's worth of heat, which means, Donnie, we're back to when you said this.
Although we may not know the source or the mechanism behind the supercooling, perhaps it is supernatural.
Me, I just thought that I'd get on here and share my thoughts. So the main thought that I've been having lately is what?
Which leaves me wondering why I still haven't gotten that admission that you promised me.
If I get a sufficient response to that, I'll admit that currently there's no solution to the heat problem.
And all of this leads me back to today's topic, the annihilation of scientific creationism. Because Donnie asks Lyle again, like 2 years later, the same question that his co-host Ramat asked him the first time.
So we have the evidence there, I think, very clearly for accelerated decay in the past. Now, the big follow-up would be from the critic and the skeptic of young Earth creation. They'll say, okay, let's assume you're right, accelerated decay has happened. That much decay in such a short amount of time, especially during the flood year, would result in so much radiation and heat as a byproduct of this accelerated decay that it would basically evaporate the oceans, melt the crust, kill Noah, his family, the animals. And so there must be a different explanation for the helium, the radio halos, and the fission tracks, because accelerated decay just doesn't work because of that after effect. And so, Dr. Lyle, I'm curious, in your opinion, what's the best way to engage and interact with that objection?
Absolutely flipping stunning. Now, I've already talked extensively about the heat problem. I've shown other people talking extensively about the heat problem and why it's still a problem. And in other videos, I have discussed how radio halos and fission tracks do not actually support the idea that accelerated nuclear decay happened. They support the idea that nuclear decay happened. And, Donnie, I never got a response to this. And in that video, I used screenshots of the published rate volumes that Lyle likes so much. So let's hear what Dr. Lyle has to say, given he has not seemingly looked into the subject since the last time he was asked this question 2 years ago.
If somebody says, well, there's a different explanation, cool, go for it. Accelerated decay is not something the Bible mentions. I'm open to other possibilities, okay? So it's just that one I think is the best.
Yeah, see, I think that this is because he knows how problematic accelerated nuclear decay is as an idea, but let's let him continue.
With regard to the two objections, and they're two separate objections, because I think one is easy to answer, that the level of radioactivity would have killed all life on Earth, killed Noah and his family. No, it just wouldn't, because they're sitting on top of a mile of water.
No, actually, Dr. Lyle, that wouldn't work. And Donnie knows this because he moderated a debate where my friend of the channel, Jordan of Reasons to Doubt, who is a nuclear engineer, explained this to David McQueen. Again, Donnie was there for this.
See, all that radiation that's causing the heat is also, radiation. You may not realize this, but your water and food are radioactive. Under normal circumstances, it's not enough to be harmful, but we're not in normal circumstances. For the exact same reason that we need to deal with 2 billion years worth of heat, we have to deal with 2 billion years worth of radiation. Some creationists have suggested that perhaps the floodwaters could have shielded Noah and his family from that radiation. Those waters themselves would be radioactive, but we'll just ignore that. No amount of floodwater below the boat is going to defend Noah from the food and water he is consuming. So we'll just look at that. The NRC has some statistics on the amount of dose that we get from food and water each year. So multiplying that out, if we accelerate the decay as needed for creationism, Noah would receive 10 lethal doses of radiation every hour straight to his internal organs from just food and water, and that's going to go on for a year. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I am confident he will not survive.
Right, so this is accelerated nuclear decay. So the decay is accelerating everywhere. It's accelerating in the water itself, it's accelerating below the water, and it's accelerating within the boat, which, as Jordan points out, Noah and the animals will not survive.
Now, the heat problem's more interesting because radioactive decay produces heat. It releases energy, and when that energy thermalizes, it causes the atoms to vibrate faster. It increases the temperature of whatever's around it. So, and that's something that, a lot of thermal energy was created during the flood year, if indeed the radioactive decay happened during the flood years, I think is the most likely model.
Right, and as I said, most young Earth creationists have to hold to some kind of accelerated nuclear decay, or else they have to put their hands up and say IDK when it comes to explaining old nuclear dates. But do you know what Dr. Lyell's solution is? One of the solutions that he posits. The first is that space acts as a heat sink, which I've been covering since my very first video on the hydroplate hypothesis. No, space doesn't work as a heat sink because you have to actually get it up there. And to get it up there, Lyell proposes the Hypercanes. Again.
I think there were probably hypercanes during Noah's flood because hurricanes today move over land. They get cut off from their power source and they peter out. There had been no land during the flood year, so hurricanes could build up to hypercanes, and that would be a really efficient way of dumping the heat to space. There have been creationist models of hypercanes, for example, which is like a hurricane, but on a much more massive scale.
Donnie knows this. He's aware of the math behind this. He knows that this doesn't work. He moderated the debate.
All we have to do is find out how much rain the storm dropped over its area and for how long, multiply that by the latent heat of condensation, and that gives us the heat it rejected. So let's do it. All I have to do is fill out these variables and we'll be done. First up, the amount of rainfall. According to the NOAA, that's the government agency that tracks hurricanes, your average hurricane drops 1.5 centimeters of rain per day over its area. The Institute for Creation Research says that hypercanes drop 10 times more rainfall than a hurricane. So let's give our hypercanes 50 times more water than a normal hurricane, a mega hypercane, if you will. Next, the area of the storm. Now, I'm not sure what the area is. Estimates vary, but I can tell you what it definitely was not more than the entire surface of the Earth. So we are going to go wall-to-wall hypercanes. Finally, the duration of the storm. According to Genesis, there was heavy rain for 40 days, light rain for 150 days, then no rain for the remaining part of the year as things dried out. Now, we could say the heavy rains are hypercanes, but maybe the light rains are hypercanes too. I mean, light is a relative term, but let's just cut straight to the chase. We're going to go year-long hypercanes 24/7, 365. Can't get more than that. So plugging all those numbers in, we get a total heat dissipation from the hypercanes, and it is a lot of heat. Unfortunately, that heat, which is 3.15 times 10 to the 26 joules, only represents 0.02% of the heat that needs to be rejected. We still have 99.98% of the heat remaining. Despite the Earth's year-long mega hypercane bonanza, the thermometer has not budged.
Oh, well, looks like the hypercanes aren't going to work, but they're not working on their own, right? The whole heat problem is solved by a bunch of random stuff, all removing the heat at once, like at least 24 things, right?
But what about the other heat rejection methods? I mean, they've got more than one, right? Well, for the sake of time, let's say we just came up with a bunch of other methods, and each and every one was just as powerful as the gold standard souped-up mega wall-to-wall hypercanes. How many methods would we need? Well, here's what the temperature looks like after applying 100 hypercane equivalent methods. Here's what it looks like after 1,000. Let's just cut to the end. Here it is after 4,500 separate methods, each and every one reducing the heat by as much as all these souped-up mega hypercanes. All of that gets us to the temperature equal to the surface of the sun.
Again, this was on Donnie's channel. He was the moderator for this debate. It's not surprising that he doesn't push back on Lyell, though, because as I've been saying for a long time on this channel, the purpose isn't to find the right answer, it is to find an answer to provide the illusion of a resolution.
It's possible that some of the heat went into the Earth. Today, the Earth has a molten core. We don't know that it always had a molten core. That's something that I've been toying with, is did some of the energy go into the Earth? And if we take all the Earth's internal heat, would that account for all the heat that was produced during accelerated decay?
It wouldn't, and we've covered this already too. This was the entire basis behind David McQueen's blob hypothesis, his idea that the mantle is what pulls the heat from the surface of the Earth and drags it down to the core, cooling the surface. But you guys know how heat flows, right? It flows from warm to cooler regions. So what that would mean is that the mantle of the Earth would have to be colder than the surface. The surface of the Earth would have to be so hot so as to force the heat to flow from the hotter surface of the planet to the cooler, molten core. Now, if you're a young Earth creationist, the gears are probably turning just like Donnie and Lyle's gears were turning, because then they start to muse about the idea that maybe at creation, the core of the Earth was like an icicle or something. They start to talk about how we can't know how hot the core was at creation. And to that I say, no. We know that the Earth's core was not an icicle. Do you know how many Earth processes depend on the core of the Earth? From the magnetic field to the movement of the continents? This is not going to solve your problem, guys. And then Lyle hits us with what is maybe the most infuriating sentence or series of sentences in this interview, at least to me.
It's not a problem, but it is something that we should investigate, and creationists are continuing to investigate. My point is, it's not a fatal problem. Nobody's come along and said, this is the amount of energy that's produced and you can't get rid of it. There's no way to get rid of it, because we know of several ways to get rid of it. So they'd have to eliminate all those as possibilities. But I think it's an ongoing investigation as to what are the mechanisms of which is the most important.
All that work, and what did it get me?
Holy... Are you fucking kidding me, Jason? Is that a joke? Nobody has done that? Nobody has calculated the amount of heat that would be produced by any given flood model and the subsections therein? No one has done that anywhere and eliminated one by one the potential solutions for said problems? No one? My goodness, good gracious, good golly, just put me down. Just put me out of my misery. Honestly, if the professional creationist can't do this tiniest little iota of work to actually find out what it is their own colleagues are saying before speaking on it, like, I'm under no delusion that Jason Lyle is going to watch anything that I make, any of my content, but at least read the stuff that your colleagues are putting out. There's not even that many of you. Come on.
Nobody's come along and said, this is the amount of energy that's produced and you can't get rid of it. There's no way to get rid of it, because we know of several ways to get rid of it. So they'd have to eliminate all those as possibilities.
We have done that, actually. We, as in the human species, have carried out those investigations. In fact, most of them have been done by young Earth creationists, Dr. Lyle, individuals who are actually within that field, doing the legwork, doing the research. They have come to the conclusion that you cannot get rid of all of this heat without a supernatural solution. Case in fucking point, John Baumgartner did an interview recently. You know, John Baumgartner, the guy who invented catastrophic plate tectonics, the flood model that Jason Lyle has discussed here. And what he has to say in this interview not only refutes everything that Jason Lyle has just said, at least with relation to the heat problem, but it also, in my opinion, signifies the death knell of scientific creationism.
And in particular, what I pointed out is that the cooling of all of today's ocean lithosphere is simply impossible in the biblical time frame. You simply do not cool a slab of rock from near its melting point to the temperature that the oceanic slabs are today in just a few thousand years. It's certainly not a single year.
Baumgartner is absolutely correct, and he is the perfect person to be saying this, given he's the guy that invented catastrophic plate tectonics and has been trying to get this to work for the longest period of time.
I try to do my science carefully, but when I hit something like that, which is like a brick wall, I find myself saying, this looks like a point at which God intervened.
Some of you out there might find that to be a frustrating response from Baumgartner, that as he's developing catastrophic plate tectonics as a flood model, once he reaches an impasse with the feasibility of young Earth creationism and a global flood from a naturalistic perspective, that he kind of puts his hands up and says, well, it must have been God. And while I empathize with where you're coming from, I vastly prefer this to the force-fitting that we so frequently see out of most young Earth creationists. This story may be just so from Baumgartner, it may be strictly religious and pretty much completely divorced from science at that point, but it's honest. As for me, this is when I stop caring completely. If you want to say that you believe that God did all of these miracles to make your particular interpretation of the Bible work, that's fine, that's on you, but that is a religious belief and it is completely untethered from the realm of empiricism. I can't do anything to disprove it because it is effectively unfalsifiable. It's not science. You've already decided you don't care what science has to say on that matter.
So one of the issues here with catastrophic plate tectonics is that you're dealing with the miraculous. And so I've not advertised that a lot. I've mentioned it in my papers, but I've not gone out of my way to advertise it. But here at this last meeting, I did highlight that we're talking about God intervening in a miraculous way, in a major miraculous way during the flood.
Again, I appreciate his honesty. I wish he had been as forthright as he's being right now back when he first pitched catastrophic plate tectonics. I think it would have saved a lot of us a lot of time.
So that's one of the issues with catastrophic plate tectonics is that it does indeed require the miraculous.
Now, if you're a young Earth creationist out there, you might be thinking, well, Baumgartner is clearly talking about catastrophic plate tectonics in particular. What does this exactly have to do with accelerated nuclear decay? Couldn't I take a different flood model and sort of pin accelerated nuclear decay onto that instead? And the answer to that is no.
And another major thing I mentioned in my 1986 paper where the miraculous has to occur has to do with the decay of radioisotopes. That in our RAPE project, several years after that, more than a decade after that, we actually demonstrated evidence for accelerated nuclear decay. So that's another example where the hand of God is required from just logic, basic logic, and applying the laws of physics.
So I would like to reiterate that the reason why the RATE team came to the conclusion that there must have been accelerated nuclear decay is not because they found proof of accelerated nuclear decay. They found extensive, ubiquitous proof that a lot of nuclear decay had occurred in all the rocks of the Earth, with the oldest being like 4.5 billion years of age. Therefore, because they presuppose that the Earth is only 6,000 years old and that there was a global flood that's responsible for the geologic column, there must have been accelerated nuclear decay. This is just a different version of that same argument that Donnie made back in the Radio Halos and Fission Tracks video. The fact that we have evidence for billions of years of radioactive decay in the rocks doesn't mean that the Earth is 6,000 years old and that decay was accelerated sometime in the past. It means the Earth isn't 6,000 years old. However, this is a huge paradigm shift from one of the biggest names in the concept of flood models. The creator of catastrophic plate tectonics, John Baumgartner here, is saying that his model requires not one, but at least 2 miracles in order for it to actually come to pass. And they're both related to the heat problem. This is what I mean when I say the heat problem has killed scientific creationism. The heat problem as an idea, as a preclusion to young Earth creationism, has forced the hand of some of these higher up, again, big names in flood models like John Baumgartner here, to appeal to the miraculous. They have finally had to take a step back and say, okay, maybe this whole thing can't be done by naturalistic processes. Maybe God really did have to intervene And this is all kind of crazy to me, right? Because the Bible doesn't talk about any of this at all. It doesn't talk about catastrophic plate tectonics or accelerated nuclear decay or anything of the sort, or God intervening periodically to do miraculous deeds in order to make this global flood feasible and simultaneously erase any presence of it ever happening. All to what? Make the earth appear to be young? But none of that is adding to Scripture. No, it's actually the theistic evolutionists who are contorting it. They're the ones who are adding to Scripture and forcing it to say things that it doesn't say. If this idea, though, that God just did a ton of miracles during the flood becomes mainstream in young earth creationism, that's the ball game for them in a lot of ways. That is a tacit admission that they can't make their worldview work without appealing to the hereto undescribed interventions of God wherever they want to make their model work, despite what we see in the natural world. And that is not very appealing when it comes to convincing others. I think that if that's the move that they make, we will continue to see young earth creationism dwindle and eventually go extinct. In the meantime, though, I'm sure they'll still give us plenty of trouble and plenty of things to talk about, which is why I'm here. If you like what I do here on this channel, please consider supporting me in the free way. You can leave a comment, like, or subscribe. And if you are leaving a comment, tell me what your favorite crazy flood model is, or make up your own if you'd like. I'm interested. And if you want to support me in more financial ways, you can join my Patreon. Patrons get early access to videos when I'm on top of things, which is, it's about 40% these days. And they get their names at the end of each and every video. So from the bottom of my gentle and of course very modern heart, I'd like to thank you for being a curious primate, and I'll see you next time.